Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sharing Stories, our podcast for our intergenerational groups. Though everyone is welcome to listen, we love it when you join us here and we get to chat for a little while. I'm Kelly Kirksey.
I'm Jeremiah Childers.
And we're so thankful that you're here with us today.
On this episode of the podcast, we are going to be talking about our childhood faith formation. And before we do that, we're going to be looking at the faith formation of Jesus. One of the things that the Gospels don't give us a lot of clear pictures of is Jesus' childhood, his early years, other than really Luke's Gospel and a little bit in Matthew.
Let's be honest, this is not, they don't give us a clear picture. They don't give us any picture. Only in Matthew and only in Luke do we hear anything about Jesus' childhood. And it is like,
just a little
so small.
But it's enough to give us awareness that Jesus grew up in a traditional Jewish home that would have practiced all the things that other Jewish families would have done. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, we can kind of get a picture of what it was like for Jesus growing up, being surrounded by older people and people who continually tell the story of God, and do that not just through words, but through actions and through song and through worship and through the ways in which we still do it today. Mm-hmm. And faith formation is something that always happens intergenerationally.
Yes.
None of us are formed by ourselves. We're always formed by the earlier generations coming alongside of us and sharing stories about who God is, what God's doing, and how God's calling us to be a part of it.
Right. I mean, that's the whole purpose of what we see in the Bible, right? Is the story of the people who have come before. Mm-hmm. And that creates our faith today.
From the earliest generation coming out of the Exodus event, being told to remember and to celebrate the Passover, to Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then to recite these things and put these things everywhere you see them, when you wake up and when you go to bed.
Right.
And for us, how are we doing that today? And looking at the story of Jesus gives us an awareness that if Jesus was being shaped and formed in childhood, we too are being shaped and formed in childhood. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're shaped and formed for good, and sometimes maybe not as good.
Right.
But each of us can look back at our childhood faith formation and say, well, that was a part of our journey, and it was an important part of our journey, even if it was not always positive.
Right.
Because it has shaped and formed us who we are today. But also it allows us to look at the next generation and say, how are we going to shape and form that next generation? So today I just want to look at a passage. And Kelly, you're our Minister of Family Life, and much of what you do is to do things differently than maybe we've done in the past, where we used to have a youth group and a children's ministry. And a lot of times we didn't include the parents.
Right.
They were just kind of there when we needed them.
Yes.
But since you've been a part of our staff, you have integrated not just youth and children into kind of one overarching ministry, but you've included parents. Uh-huh. And some of the things I've reflected on as I've thought about this podcast today has been our adventure luncheons.
Uh-huh. Which is going to be coming up in not very long. Little plug for there.
The Lytton
journey.
The Lytton journey that we meet together as families. And some of the other things that you've done through your ministry here that incorporates the whole family in not just children, but youth, parents, grandparents, being a part of the same ministry. And I think that is really what New Testament life would have been like. It was what Jewish life would have been like. And it's really what life would have been like up until probably the 1900s.
Oh, yeah. It's always interesting when you read in the Bible, you almost never see children. Mm-hmm. They're just not talked about.
But they were there.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, we look at our lives, and so you assume, like when you read, we always bring ourselves into the text. We can't help it. It's just our point of view of the world. And so we think, okay, well, only the people they mention are the ones that are there. But the reality is they didn't have childcare. Yeah. They didn't have a CDC. They didn't have, they just had family. And so any religious event that goes on in the community always has children at it. I think we think about our church services and our kids go to children's church. There was no children's church. They were there. The babies were crawling around under, people's legs, and babies were crying and people were talking. I mean, it was much more chaotic than I think when we look at the passages where like everyone sat down and they all listened to Jesus preaching on, the Sermon on the Mount. They all just sat quietly. Like, no, like that wasn't how it was. It was very rambunctious, if you will. So you can almost always assume that there were children in the room, even if they're not mentioned.
Well, and even when they are, the disciples are sometimes like, get away, kids.
Right.
Get away. And Jesus says, no, let them come to me.
Yeah.
Because they're important to Jesus. And faith formation for Jesus is important not just for children, but for those that might be early Christians. We'd probably be immature Christians. But let's just look at a couple short passages. I'm just going to read a little bit of two different stories that we have of Jesus. The first one comes in chapter 2 of Luke, verses 22 and following. And it's right after Jesus has been born. 8 days has passed. He's been circumcised. They've given him the name Jesus. And then later on, Jesus is taken by his mother and his father to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. And it's a beautiful story. We won't read all of it, but in that story, we meet two older people.
Yeah.
That although Jesus as a baby is probably not aware of what's going on, they are important to Jesus' story because they're an earlier generation blessing a younger child. And in our congregation, a lot of times some of our older adults might get to meet some of the children as babies and may not be around for their whole lives, but because they're there, they represent that God loves them and cares for them.
Yeah.
So let's just read just very quickly. When the time came for the purification according to the law of Moses, they brought him, Jesus, up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male shall be designated as holy to the Lord. And they offered a sacrifice according to what is stated in the law, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And then we meet Simeon, and then we meet Anna, and both of those see in Jesus that he's the Messiah.
Right.
But it is in this act of worship of parents coming to essentially dedicate their child to God.
Yeah.
And today we see in our tradition, our Baptist tradition, parents coming and dedicating their children and saying that as parents we dedicate not only that we will teach and show Jesus to our children, but we're allowing the church to dedicate that too.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful moment. Later in Luke chapter 2, we see that they go back home to their town of Nazareth, and there Jesus grows up. He becomes strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was on him. Now, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. So we can imagine, year 1, year 2, Jesus is growing up, going every year to the festival of Passover in Jerusalem. But at 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. And at the festival ended, they started to return, and the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. They started to look for him among the relatives and friends, and they did not find him. So Jesus is 12. He's not quite a man.
Right.
But he's not really a boy.
He's at the in-between.
The in-between.
He's a tween, if you will.
He's a tween. And I've got one at home, and it's rough.
It's a lot that happens in those ages.
It is. And it's kind of that age where you want your independence and you're trying to find out who you are. But Jesus, they think, well, maybe he's with the women because he's younger. Mm-hmm. And then the women probably think, well, maybe he's with the men because he thinks he's older.
Right.
And, it's kind of like Home Alone. It's not until they get halfway home they go, ah! So yes. They returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he had said. They went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. Jesus increased in wisdom, in years, and in divine and human favor. I love the story because Jesus stays and talks with those that are older. He's learning. They're impressed with him. He's impressed with them. And his parents show up. And, I just imagine how frustrated I've been when Lily just walks off.
Oh, yeah.
And what are you doing?
Right.
And he's like, well, where else would I be?
Right.
And they're like, no, stop, come on. And it says, he was obedient after that. So it gives us a little hint that Jesus was a little mischievous
Yeah.
growing up.
Well, if he's human, right?
He's human. But it is in this story of coming to essentially, we wouldn't call it church, but coming to worship. Coming to the place where you learn about who God is and what God's doing. And for 12 years up into that, and then years after that, Jesus is going to Jerusalem. He's a part of this story that remembers God's liberation, God's grace, God's redemption. And over again, Jesus is a part of that story.
Right.
And it shapes and forms him. Not only that, he's going to synagogue every week. He's hearing the word being read. And for us, when we think of these stories, it reminds me of a conference I went to probably like 2011. And a guy that used to be at CBF National, now he's a pastor, Rick Bennett, did a whole conference, or not a conference, but a seminar on Jesus's early faith formation. He uses this text and uses like Jewish practices in Jesus's day. And it was really the first time I ever really thought about, Jesus grew up in a family.
Yeah.
And Jesus had to go to synagogue.
Right.
And Jesus had to go to Passover.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me that Jesus grew up in a family just like me.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that was important for Jesus to not only experience those things, but to be around people that were older than him and younger than him as he grew up. And to see, they are sharing God's story over and over again at every meal.
Yeah.
And every Sabbath. So as the minister of family life, mm-hmm. I want you to tell us a little bit about how important is family faith formation.
Well, I don't know that there is any way to overstate the importance of family faith formation. Part of the reason that we are so, we put so much emphasis on the family unit, whether that is, children and parents, or children and grandparents, or children and aunts and uncles, whoever it is that is pouring into the lives of these kids, it's important that their faith is developed enough to do that. Mm-hmm. It's important that they are equipped, because I know that we as adults, we don't feel like we know everything. Mm-hmm. And children ask very hard questions. Yeah. And are extremely curious and don't mind voicing things that maybe we don't feel comfortable to voice a lot of times. And so it can be kind of a daunting task to say, okay, well, I have a child and I am going to be their faith formation person. And I do think for like a period of time, there was sort of this idea of like, well, we go to church and they are the faith formation of our family. And the reality is, if you come to church every single Sunday, mm-hmm. which a lot of people don't, and that's not, life has gotten much more complicated than it was. Everything's not closed on Sunday anymore. So people have to work. Sports and things all happen on Sundays. And so people go and they're gone for 1 weekend a month or 2 weekends a month. And
people's jobs, working on weekends. And, and sometimes maybe Sunday's the only day that somebody can actually rest.
Right. Yeah. And so the reality of us being a child's faith formation, as us meaning the church as a whole, it's just unrealistic.
Yeah.
That maybe if you come every single Sunday and every single Wednesday night, we see your child 3 hours a week.
Yeah.
And they're not getting faith formation that entire time, mm-hmm. Because part of it's just having fun. Yeah. And that's important too. Mm-hmm. But that's not enough.
Yeah.
And the other piece of that is that your children, their whole view of the world from when they come into the world is you.
Yeah.
You know, like they've done studies where they have a mom and a baby in front of a mirror, and she like touches her nose and the baby will touch its nose because they don't understand that they're a different person than their mother, you know, because they haven't been for a long time, you know, and so
there's no self-differentiation.
Right, there's no self-differentiation, and so like when your child comes into the world, their first understanding of trust, their first understanding of love, their first feelings of security that they cannot name or comprehend come from that unit.
Yeah.
And so it's so important that their first understanding of love, which will hopefully, inevitably be part of their understanding of God.
And it does, whether you intentionally know it or not.
Right, is positive.
Yeah.
You know, and so you can't even overstate how integrated all of the home life is with the spiritual formation.
Yeah.
You're constantly being formed spiritually.
Yeah.
You know, and to pretend that they're different worlds, you know, your spiritual world and your life outside of church, they're not different. They are so the same. And so that's why it's so important to teach the entire family unit, to equip parents to be the spiritual leaders of their homes and to ask questions, you know, and to make faith talk part of every day.
Yeah.
Because those 3 hours are not enough to be able to teach your children about Jesus. And the reality is, even if it was enough, which it's not, but even if it was, they're going to be learning what Jesus looks like constantly from you. And children will pick it out so fast if you are like, we love, you know, we want to tell everyone about Jesus. We will not bring this friend of yours to church.
Yeah.
Because they just do, you know, and they're like, well, there's an inconsistency there. Yeah. And so it's a daunting task, but it's so important that we come in and know, like, okay, you will be forming your child. Whether you want to or not, you are. And so how do we do that well?
Yeah. And, you know, as minister of spiritual formation, I remind people everything is spiritual. Everything we do. So one of the things I try to tell couples before they get married is, you know, think about when you become a parent, that from the day one, you're teaching your children what God's like, for good or bad.
Right.
You know, if you raise your voice, if you use shame, if you use, you know, guilt, all those things kind of begin to teach people, you know, what is God like. Other things I want us to think about is, you know, at a certain point in a child's growth, they begin to look outside of parents for guidance.
Right.
Jesus, I love in this story, he's at that tween age, and one of the things I know is that at some point in Lily's growth, she needs somebody other than me to talk about faith, because she hears my voice, you know, talking about get your homework done and do this and do that. And she's at that age where she tunes me out.
Right.
And here, Jesus must have tuned Mary and Joseph out, because he's obviously not even paid attention that they've left.
Right, yeah.
You know, and he's listening to older, probably men, and engaging them. And for me, as we'll talk in a minute about our own faith formation, you know, I loved my mom and dad, and they would talk about God sometimes. And when they did, I would listen, but it was really my grandparents and maybe an older generation that had lived more experiences,
right,
but weren't the ones telling me to get my homework done. And, you know, you tune people out after a while.
Right, yeah.
And that's one of the reasons the intergenerational small group is so important, is that we're meeting new people, younger, older, that we're not as familiar with, and their voices are new to us, and we hear their stories anew. So I love the story that Jesus essentially tuned them out, but when he gets home, he realizes he can't do that again.
Right.
Because he
got in
becomes
trouble.
obedient. Yeah, he did get in trouble. But his parents were loving and caring enough that they, you know, probably used that experience not only for his, you know, growth, but also as a teaching moment. And I think as parents, one of the things we don't think of ourselves necessarily in that role, but we are teachers of Jesus. We are disciple makers.
Right.
And every moment in our relationship with our children or our grandchildren or just children around us is a teaching moment that we can teach them who God is, what God's like, and what this life in Christ is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So, Kelly, as you think about your story, is there a story of you as a child that is cemented in kind of you thinking about what it was like for your faith to be shaped as you grew up? Is there any like one story, one moment that just kind of comes to you and just says, hey, this is it?
That kind of encapsulates my whole faith journey.
Not your faith journey,
That's a lot of pressure, Jeremiah.
but your childhood faith, like growing up in the church. You talked last week about your parents being Sunday school teachers, those
Yeah,
sorts
they
of
were.
things. But is there, for me, I'll give an example. I grew up in different denomination, Church of God, and we would go to church. Usually, my mom would take me and my brother to church, and sometimes my grandparents came until my grandfather couldn't. And it was interesting. We would go to church and we'd hear about God and how much God loves us. But by the end of the service, I was always watching everybody go up to the altar to get saved again. Because in Church of God, salvation's kind of temporal.
Yeah.
And, if you sin that week, you do something. And I would watch these little old ladies go down and pray. And I'm, 12, 13, and I would think, oh my goodness, what did they do this week?
Yeah.
I mean, because I've done way worse than him. Because I know these ladies, and they're. But then, so I would have all these questions about who God is, what's this life of faith like. But then we would immediately go to my grandparents' house, and it was a different way of talking about God. It wasn't, I grew up afraid of God more than I felt loved by God.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't until later that I kind of realized, grace is so much bigger than what I imagined growing up. And yes, God calls us to live a life of faith that loves God with all of our heart and loves our neighbor as ourselves. And to do that is a continual process, but it begins with grace. And grace is something that we can't earn and we can't give away. It's always there for us. And I didn't learn that till later. But my grandparents would talk in such a way that I would get hints of it at their house. And they would share about how God worked in their lives that week, or how God had worked in their lives in childhood. And for me, that was probably a better representation of God than maybe what I got on Sunday mornings in church. Not that there weren't good sermons, not that the choir didn't sing, not that that wasn't real worship, but sometimes the images of God I got in the church I grew up in were, one, I would hear God loves me, and then I would feel like God hated me too.
Uh-huh.
Because I didn't live up to some standard. And at 13, 14, nobody's going to live up to a standard. So, for me, those were kind of the images of faith formation. One, going to worship, but also really hearing the story of God told from my grandparents each week.
Right.
And it was in those stories that when I went to college and started going to a Baptist church, that those were the stories that really helped me understand faith as I got to that place where it became my own, rather than necessarily what I heard in church.
Yeah.
And I hope that's not an experience people have here.
Yeah.
And not everybody that grew up in that denomination had that experience. It was my experience. So I'm not going to lay it on everybody else. But what about for you?
I think that for me, like I said last week, my family we were at church a lot. And so church and family was very integrated. Mm-hmm. I have an older brother and older sister, and my brother's 7 years older than me, and my sister's 5 years older than me. And so, when I was going through, when I'm 12, they're in college, mm-hmm. And so I kind of got to be in like the backseat of their faith formation, mm-hmm. which was an interesting, and I got to see, one of my earlier memories of church when we lived in St. Louis, which meant I was not even in second grade yet, was watching my dad get baptized. Mm-hmm. And so that was really interesting to get to be a part of that piece of his faith formation. And so now I look back on those things and I think, oh, I didn't understand then what I understand now, like how hard it would be as an adult who'd been in the church his whole life to then say, actually, maybe I didn't get this, and what an honor it was to get to see him kind of go through that. I do think my biggest thing as maybe the little picture of my larger faith journey would be that maybe it was because my dad got baptized as an adult, but we were always allowed to ask questions. I can remember when my brother went to college, and he's a minister, and so he was taking all these courses, and he'd come home and he and my dad would argue about the Bible. And that was, they would argue. Sometimes you were like, well, this is not an argument, this is kind of a fight now. But it was okay to do that. We had discussions, I grew up in a more traditional Baptist church. There was no dancing. We didn't clap. There was none of that business. I got in trouble one time because I danced down the aisle to our Christmas musical presentation because I was just so excited as a very young child.
You would have fit in the Church of God.
No, I got in a lot of trouble. That was not acceptable. I was the opposite
in the Church of God. That's one of the reasons I didn't feel, because I couldn't keep rhythm, and I didn't like to raise my arms.
Yeah, you were like, we're supposed to dance. I don't want to dance.
Yeah.
And I was like, we're not even supposed to clap, but I really need the dancing. Yeah. But yeah, and so I think that being able to ask those questions and to argue and to disagree and to be able to say, like, even today, now in my relationship with my mom and dad, we'll talk about those things and we don't always agree. We still don't agree, and it always makes me laugh. My dad will say, I just don't understand how I raised you guys, I know. And then he'll say, but gosh, I'm so glad you can think on your own.
Yeah.
And how important that is. But to be able to come and have an opinion and have a viewpoint that may not be the same.
Yeah.
And as it relates to faith, where it's not just like, because I can remember a friend when I came back from college and we were discussing, I think it was women in ministry. And I said, I just don't believe that anymore, that women can't be ministers. And she said, well, and I said, why do you think that? And she said, well, I guess it's just what I have always thought. And it was what I've always known.
Yeah.
And it was like, I thought, well, that's not acceptable. I thought, well, don't you want this to have a reason? I didn't I couldn't comprehend. And I think it was because I grew up in this environment where it was okay to come and say, I don't know that I think that. You didn't come to the table and say, I don't think that, and not have a reason.
Well, you can imagine, Jesus's family being around Jesus and older folks around Jesus, and Jesus says, well, you've heard it was said.
Right, yeah. He's like,
but I say,
let me quote some scripture for you.
But I say,
yeah.
And sometimes it is, part of the generational mix in the life of faith is there is differences on issues maybe that aren't necessarily the central issue. Because
right.
What you're saying is your dad loves Jesus just as much as you love Jesus.
Yes.
And, we can love Jesus and generationally maybe disagree on some issues or some things that maybe, I remember talking to my parents after going to seminary about certain issues of, doctrine or what maybe I didn't hold to growing up that they held to. And it was some of those things that at the end of the day aren't necessarily things that we'll ever talk about again.
Right.
They're not things that are going to divide us because we still love Jesus. And I do love the idea that Jesus not only as a child was around older people, but as he continues to minister, that he's around children.
Yes.
And they're seeing him and experiencing him. And that's a beautiful image.
Well, that's what I tell, Riley and Emmy just got baptized. And, in their last class, we're up in the baptismal, we're walking through what baptism is going to be like. And Dr. Moore and I always say to them, like, you're preaching your sermon right now and you're not saying a word. But the reality is they started asking questions because they saw someone else get baptized.
Yeah.
And it was not an adult because it was another child, and there are all these, and who they ask the questions to are the adults. Yeah. Then they start asking questions, but they see what's going on around them, and then they need someone to help explain it. Yeah. What I love about this story is really the age that he is at. I think that as parents, we get really frustrated when our kids hit this age and they don't want to do what we want them to do, and they don't want to accept our answers anymore, and we are not the authority anymore. It's sort of this, like, I feel like it's almost a repeat of when they're like 2 and 3. Yeah. When they're tiny, they just want to be with you and they just want to be held. But then when they get to be 2 or 3, they start wandering off. Yeah. And they're supposed to. It's developmentally exactly what they're supposed to do. And that's how it is between that, like 9 to 11 is kind of when they start to push those boundaries. And then you're just, it's Pandora's box. You're never going to have them back again exactly the way it was.
And that's why it's so important that, church and family is extended beyond just mom and dad.
Yes.
It needs to be more people. One of the things, and our time's running out, but one of the things that you've talked about since you've been here was the book Sticky Faith. And how that, as people children go to college, those that have had relationships beyond their parents, but with other adults in church, are the ones that are more likely to stay in church, either coming back to their home church or staying in a church in general. And part of it is because they've made relationships and they've seen the life of faith played out more than just in their home,
right,
but in other people's. And that's important. As we wrap up today, any last thoughts you have about family faith formation?
I have lots of thoughts about it, Jeremiah, but we don't have time for all of that. So
come ask.
It's important. I guess we'll just end on, it's important. It's so important. And we do get this like very small picture, but I feel like it's almost like a microcosm. It's like this picture of Jesus's life that's just a short snapshot, but it tells so much about his larger life.
It does.
And the importance of, that in our lives.
And I think, the older we get, sometimes the more we look backwards at our parents and appreciate what they've done. One of the things I find curious about church life is the music that sometimes people, as they get older, prefer isn't necessarily the music that they grew up wanting to sing, but what their parents sang.
Right.
And it kind of ties them to them after they're gone.
Yeah.
A lot of times when, we experience those kind of dialogue in church and people want to sing certain songs, I have to remind myself, it's not necessarily because it was the song they like singing, it's because it connects them to the generation that taught them about Jesus. And that's a beautiful kind of image sometimes to think about when we're in worship. Well, we hope you have a great week. Go out and be around those that aren't your age and share the story of Jesus intergenerationally, whether it's in our groups or whether it's in your family or in the larger church. We'll see you next time.
All right. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.